Hey everyone! Tonight we are diving into a story so wonderfully improbable, so rich with the grit of high plains and the dusty corridors of military bureaucracy that it genuinely sounds like something cooked up in a screenwriting workshop. But it is entirely true. Imagine this. You are not in your cozy chair right now. You are standing on the Kazakh steppes, a land so vast and flat that the horizon feels like it's curving away from you in every direction. The air is dry and carries the scent of sagebrush and coal dust. The year is the late 1870s. You squint your eyes against the punishing glare and the endless churn of brown grass. You hear the rhythmic thudding of hooves, not a pleasant trot, but a hard, desperate gallop. In the distance, silhouetted against a brutal sun, is a figure on a horse, moving with astonishing speed and endurance. Carrying a prize that represents wealth and freedom in this harsh landscape, a string of rustled horses, this figure, this ghost of the plains, is Muhammad Kusanov. He's not a general or a famous inventor. He's a horse thief, a very, very successful one. His survival depended entirely on his ability to outrun pursuit over unimaginable distances, day after relentless day. He wasn't just fast, he was durable. And the secret to his durability and, crucially, the durability of his mount was the very saddle beneath him. This saddle was not just a seat, it was a piece of organic, essential, life-saving engineering. Born not from a drafting table, but from the desperate practicality of a life lived on horseback. Kusanov wasn't worried about filing a patent. He was worried about being caught and hanged. Yet the design he perfected on the run, a design meant for the punishing, ceaseless demands of a nomadic outlaw, would eventually cross continents pass through. The scrutiny of Tsarist officers impress American military observers and astonishingly become the standard military saddle across the United States Army, enduring well into the 20th century. Think about that for a second. The design for a piece of equipment used by hundreds of thousands of U.S. cavalry troopers from the Plains Wars to World War I was essentially ripped off a Kazakh horse thief. You probably wouldn't survive the first 48 hours riding the distances Kusanov covered, let alone the constant anxiety of a posse on your heels. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening in, let me know what city you're in and what time it is for you right now. I always find it bizarrely comforting to know we're all sharing this moment. Scattered across time zones, focused on a horse thief from the 19th century steppes. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the wind whipping past your face now, standing there on the steppes. It's a sensory overload of cold air and sun-baked earth. You realize that in this environment, a horse is not a luxury. It is your entire universe. It is your transportation, your wealth, your partner in crime, and your only hope of escape. If your horse breaks down, you die. It's that simple. And what breaks a horse down faster than anything, besides poor feed, is an improperly designed saddle. For centuries, riders had struggled with the same fundamental biomechanical problem. Traditional saddles, especially those designed in Europe for flash and parade, often concentrated the rider's weight right on the most sensitive parts of the horse's back, the withers, the spine, and the kidneys. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it caused crippling injuries, a phenomenon known as saddle galls deep. Festering sores could take a horse out of commission for months, effectively marooning the rider. The pain for the horse was constant, and the resulting fatigue was a death sentence for a thief constantly on the move. This is the ancient problem that Kusanov, the practical engineer, was trying to solve, not for glory, but for survival. His work was driven by a ruthless cost-benefit analysis. The better his saddle protected his horse, the longer and harder his horse could run, and the longer he could stay free. It was a matter of life and death, not merely comfort. It's funny how often the greatest innovations are born not from funded research labs, but from desperate necessity, usually involving someone who is trying to get away with something. Imagine the patent application. Improved design for evasion-based equestrian activities. Kusanov understood the physics of weight. Distribution better than most high-ranking military officers of the time. He saw the necessity of lifting the entire structure of the saddle, the rider, the gurov, the horse's susceptible spine. This simple, yet revolutionary insight would define his design. You sense the shift in the air, the transition from the frantic pace of the chase to the quiet desperation of daily life on the plains. You are witnessing the riders, the legitimate ones, the herders, the messengers, the meager czarist border guards, and you immediately grasp the scale of their physical torment. Look at the faces of these men. They are gaunt, weathered, and they move with the stiff, unnatural gait of someone constantly battling pain. Their lower backs are perpetually strained, their inner thighs rubbed raw. This isn't just discomfort. It is a chronic career-ending condition known in its most severe form as rider's malaise. For centuries, the human body was simply assumed to be incompatible with prolonged high-intensity riding. People believed that if you were going to ride for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, you simply had to suffer. It was the price of mobility. Traditional Western and many Asian saddles at the time, while varying wildly in aesthetics, shared a key flaw. They often employed a rigid, flat panel that, under the strain of a rider's weight and the constant shock of galloping, transmitted every impact directly through the seat bones and up the spine. Imagine sitting on a vibrating park bench for 8 hours a day, every day, and that's a polite approximation. But the real, unspoken tragedy lay with the horses. Look closer at a horse being unsaddled after a long trek. The sweat is steaming, but the real tell is the patches of skin above the spine. They are often inflamed, hot to the touch, and sometimes the skin has broken entirely. These saddle sores, or galls, weren't minor abrasions. They were deep tissue injuries that could quickly become infected, leading to debilitating lameness. A soldier or a horse thief might be tough enough to push through personal pain, but once the horse was crippled, the mission or the escape was over. This is the core problem Muhammad Kusanov was obsessed with solving. He wasn't working from theory, he was working from necessity. He was trying to eliminate the downtime. Every hour his horse spent recuperating was an hour he risked capture. This is where his ergonomic revelation begins to take shape. Kusanov, perhaps unknowingly, was practicing advanced biomechanics. He sought a solution that decoupled the rider's weight from the horse's sensitive spine. He would have seen firsthand the failures of standard equipment. You might observe a Russian infantry saddle, for instance, a heavy leather-bound monstrosity that looked good in a barracks but was a disaster in the field. Historians still argue whether the primary reason for early Russian cavalry inefficiency in Central Asia was poor training or simply fatally flawed equipment. But the saddle certainly played a huge part. You can try to be the toughest soldier in the world, but if your horse's back is raw, you are going nowhere fast. Now, think about the cultural context. In the nomadic cultures of Central Asia, the relationship with the horse was far more intimate and practical than in European militaries. The horse was family. Horsemen intuitively understood equine anatomy. They knew that the horse's back could support massive weight, provided that weight was distributed evenly across the large, strong muscles flanking the spine, not directly on the spine itself. This cultural knowledge, combined with Kusanov's high-stakes need for performance, led to his design principles. You can almost see him sketching in the dust with a stick, realizing that the solution wasn't padding or softer leather. The solution was structure a skeletal frame that acted like a bridge. He needed a sturdy saddle tritha, internal framework that held the weight high and clear of the horse's spine, transferring the load to the ribcage and the powerful shoulders and loin muscles, areas better suited to sustained effort. This is a mainstream historical fact. Early 19th century military saddles, with a few exceptions like the Hungarian and Turkish models, were notoriously ill-fitting and detrimental to long-term equine health, seriously limiting the logistical reach of cavalry forces globally. Kusanov's innovation was essentially fixing the central design failure of the era. Here, a quirky tidbit about the lengths riders went to cope in some parts of the steppes. Riders would actually apply a thick paste made of animal fat, ash, and sometimes even mud to the horse's back before riding, hoping the messy, temporary barrier would somehow reduce friction and prevent galls. It rarely worked, often just creating a filthy, abrasive layer that made the problem worse. Imagine having to slather that concoction on your horse every morning just to prepare for work. That's commitment to poor technology. You realize Kusanov's ambition was simple but profound: to create a saddle that allowed a horse to run 100 kilometers a day, every day, without injury. It was a simple question of engineering efficiency, and the next step was realizing the precise geometry needed to achieve it. He had to build that bridge. You are now looking directly at the culmination of Kusanov's experience, the physical realization of his engineering insight. It doesn't look like the padded, luxurious saddles you might see in a modern stable. It is skeletal, practical, and almost brutally simple. This is Kusanov's ergonomic revelation, and you can trace its genius in 3 distinct features: the pommel, the cantle, and the central void. First, look at the pommel. That's the front arch, the part that rises high over the horse's shoulders or withers. Unlike most flat European saddles that seemed to want to crush the horse's back, Kusanov's pommel soars. It is tall, sharply angled, and crucially allows a massive space, what horsemen call the gullet, to clear the horse's spine completely. Even when the horse's muscles bunch up during a hard gallop, or when the rider shifts violently, the pommel ensures there is no contact, no pinching, and no debilitating pressure on that vulnerable area. This single feature radically reduced wither damage, which was the bane of cavalry mounts. Second, pivot your attention to the back, the cantle. It is equally high, often sweeping up dramatically. This wasn't merely for looks. It served a vital, functional purpose for the rider. On the flat steps, where a rider might spend 18 hours straight in the saddle, often dozing while the horse ambled, this high cantle provided essential back support. It acted like a semi-reclined chair back, supporting the lumbar spine and mitigating the constant low-grade muscle strain that caused riders' malaise that we talked about earlier. Moreover, during hard stops, sudden maneuvers, or when firing a weapon, the high cantle provided an anchor point, bracing the rider and preventing them from being thrown backward. And third, look at the structure itself. It's essentially a pair of wooden sidebars running parallel to the horse's back, connected and held apart by those 2 tall arches. This creates the central void. This is the core principle. The saddle doesn't sit on the spine, it sits around the spine. The weight of the rider is distributed exclusively onto the large, dense muscle groups that flank the spine, the longissimus dorsi muscles. These muscles are designed for powerful movement and sustained effort, and they can handle the load far better than the vertebrae. You are seeing here a truly mainstream historical fact in action. The fundamental principle of the modern saddle tria. Rigid weight-bearing frame, suspended over the spine, originates directly from the necessities of steppe warfare and nomadic lifelong, predating its formal adoption by Western armies. The genius of Kusanov's design wasn't just in the height, but in the minimal contact points. The frame, or tree, was covered by minimal padding, often just layers of thick felt or blanket, which could be easily cleaned or replaced. This lack of bulk was intentional. Fewer layers meant less heat trapped, fewer folds to cause friction, and a lighter overall weight, all essential factors in high-endurance riding. Here, as a quirky tidbit about the cantle, the extreme height of some early steppe saddles was only for back support. It was occasionally used as a subtle form of saddle decoration or status symbol. Nomads would sometimes affix small carved figures or polished bone segments to the cantle's peak, which, in the chaos of a horse raid, served as a fleeting visual identifier in the swirling dust and motion. It was the equestrian equivalent of having fancy hubcaps on your getaway car. A bit impractical, but hey, a thief needs some flair, right? The resulting saddle design was inherently stable. It minimized lateral sit-to-toe side shifting, which is a key contributor to saddle sores. When you sit in it, you don't feel like you are perched on the horse. You feel locked into the horse. Your center of gravity is lower relative to the horse's movement, allowing for better balance, especially when leaning out of the saddle to retrieve something or swing a weapon. You can almost hear the endless academic debates raging over this design. Historians still argue whether Kusanov's specific innovation was a genuine solitary leap of design genius, or simply the masterful refinement of already existing fragmented Central Asian saddle technologies, perhaps borrowing elements from Kyrgyz or Mongolian frameworks and perfecting them for the grueling conditions of the Kazakh region. Either way, his name is inextricably linked to the form that was about to change global military logistics. The materials used in this prototype design were, of course, entirely organic, reflecting the resources available on the steppe. That est, the next critical piece of the puzzle, how Kusanov built something so revolutionary using nothing but what he could find or steal. You shift your focus now from the geometry of the saddle to the very essence of its construction. The materials of the steppe. What makes Kusanov's design a practical masterpiece is that it could be manufactured, maintained, and repaired with the limited resources available to a nomadic horseman, far from any established European supply chain or factory. The cornerstone of the saddle was the saddle tree, which, as you know, is the rigid internal frame. This was crafted primarily from local woods. Specifically, he would have used tough, relatively light, and durable species found in the scattered riparian zones or mountain foothills, often birch, willow, or even hard scrub woods like tamarisk. The wood was carefully selected, shaped, and then often reinforced. Crucially, this wooden frame was never held together with metal nails or screws in the early designs. Metal was expensive, rusted easily in damp conditions, and could introduce weak points through which the wood might split. Instead, the tree was held together using the ultimate step material, rawhide. Strips of fresh scraped animal hide, typically from a cow or horse, were painstakingly wrapped, tied, and glued around the joints and structural elements while still wet. As the rawhide dried and cured, it contracted, pulling the wooden pieces into an unbelievably tight, almost monolithic structure. This rawhide lacing and wrapping gave the tree an astonishing combination of rigidity and resilience. It could absorb impact and flex slightly without breaking, unlike brittle metal or poorly jointed wooden frames. It was, essentially, a biological composite material. And it is a mainstream historical fact that rawhide lacing was the go-to structural adhesive and fastener across Central Asian and indigenous American saddle designs for this very reason. The seat and ground contact points were handled with layers of felt. Felt made from compressed sheep's wool was ubiquitous on the steppes. It was easily sourced, naturally shock-absorbent, breathable, and provided an excellent, forgiving cushion between the rigid wooden tree and the horse's back. Unlike leather, which can stiffen and crack, or cheap canvas, which quickly chafes, felt compresses without losing its protective qualities, and perhaps most importantly for a thief, it's quiet. You wouldn't want a squeaky leather saddle advertising your location at 2 in the morning. This is where you see the sheer practicality of the outlaw engineer. Every component was chosen for its ruggedness and ease of field repair. If a wooden piece cracked, a skilled horseman could carve a replacement and rewrap it with rawhide within a few hours. If the felt padding wore thin, a new blanket could be folded and tied beneath the tree. The durability and self-sufficiency of the design were paramount. Here's a quirky tidbit: to make the felt padding water-resistant and even tougher, nomadic saddle makers would sometimes treat it with fermented milk curds or sheep tallow. This created a tough, waxy layer. The resulting smell was probably intense, a mixture of old wool, sour dairy, and horse sweat, but it meant the saddle wouldn't quickly become waterlogged and heavy when crossing a river or enduring a sudden downpour. You might have excellent ergonomics, but you'd certainly smell like a walking dairy farm. As you examine the simple, elegant structure, you realize that the absence of heavy, complex leather skirts, or skirts common in European saddles, was another intentional element. These skirts added weight, trapped heat, and served no structural purpose in Kusanov's design. His saddle was stripped down to the minimum necessary framework to bear the load and protect the horse. The sheer efficiency of this design soon attracted the attention of those who were supposed to be pursuing Kusanov. The Russian Empire's slow, grinding push eastward brought their military right to the edges of the steppes, and they were having serious logistical problems. Their European equipment was failing spectacularly in the heat, the cold, and the unrelenting distances. They needed a saddle that wouldn't cripple their horses after 2 weeks in the field, and Kusanov's design, proven by the very outlaws they were chasing, was staring them in the face. Historians still argue whether the initial adoption of the steppe-style saddle by the Russians was a direct result of captured equipment, or whether Russian Cossack units, who had long interactions with Central Asian peoples, independently incorporated elements of the design before Kusanov's specific saddle gained prominence. Regardless, the need was clear, and the solution came from the enemy. You understand that innovation doesn't care about legal boundaries or social class. A genius design, whether created by a celebrated inventor or a wanted criminal, will eventually find its user base, especially when it solves a military-grade logistical nightmare. The Tsarist frontier was about to learn a lesson in practical engineering from the very man they hoped to arrest. The sound of your boots crunching on the dusty earth shifts to the rhythmic clank of metal and the muffled commands in Russian. You are no longer observing a lone outlaw. You are now witnessing the slow, bureaucratic machinery of the Tsarist frontier's attention grinding into motion. The Russian Imperial Army, specifically the Cossack units patrolling the sprawling Turkestan region and the Siberian borders, were the first to pragmatically acknowledge the genius of the steppe saddle. These patrols were the sharp end of the great game, that shadowy 19th century geopolitical tussle between the Russian and British empires for control of Central Asia. Success in this vast, punishing theater depended entirely on logistics and mobility. If your Cossack patrols couldn't cover the distances reliably, the British influence, or hostile tribes, would gain the upper hand. The standard-issue Russian military equipment, designed for campaigns in Poland or the Crimea, was proving to be a catastrophic liability here. Their horses were constantly breaking down due to the saddle design flaws. We discussed the severe withergalls, the compromised backs, the constant need for recuperation. Cossack units, who lived much closer to the nomadic lifestyle than their counterparts in Moscow, were often the first to unofficially adopt local, practical solutions. They didn't care about regulations. They cared about survival and mission accomplishment. They saw the horse thieves and local riders like Kusanov moving with an efficiency they could only dream of. The horses ridden by the nomads covered astronomical distances with seemingly less strain. The pragmatic solution: steal or adapt the local design. This is a mainstream historical fact. The integration of indigenous equipment and methods by Imperial Russian forces, particularly the Cossacks, was common practice on the periphery of the empire, where European doctrine failed. The Kazakh saddle, or adaptations of it, began appearing unofficially within frontline units as field modifications. You might be wondering how an outlaw's design makes it into official military procurement. It's simple: field performance. A Cossack officer reports that his company, using modified saddles, rode 500 versts, about 330 miles, in less time and with fewer lame horses than the unit next to them using official kit. This kind of undeniable efficiency gets noticed, even in a system as cumbersome as the Tsarist bureaucracy. Word moved up the chain of command, not through grand design boards, but through gritty performance reports. The Russian quartermaster corps needed a solution fast. They realized that spending money on better veterinary care was pointless if the fundamental tool, the saddle, was the root cause of the injury. They began formal trials of the Turkestan or Kyrgyz-type saddle, which was essentially Kusanov's perfected design. Here's a quirky tidbit about the early trials. To test the saddle's resilience against chafing, some Russian trial commissions didn't rely just on distance. They would often ride the horses through deep, abrasive mud and then immediately into dry, gritty sand, creating a kind of sandpaper effect on the horse's back. A brutal test designed to replicate the worst field conditions imaginable. The saddles that kept the horse's back clear of that muck like Kusanov, as high-gallitted, frame passed the test with flying colors. The European saddles, which sat lower and collected grit, failed miserably. The Russian army's first official adaptation, though not yet the final version, was recognized for its lightweight and its remarkable ability to reduce damage to the horse. It was an acknowledgement that the enemy had produced superior military technology, a concept rarely admitted in 19th century Europe. Historians still argue whether the credit for formally introducing the design to the wider Russian military establishment belongs to a particular individual. Officer, perhaps a colonel, who championed the cause, or whether it was simply the overwhelming, undeniable statistical evidence of superior equine health that finally forced the conservative hand of the Ordnance Department in St. Petersburg. What you are observing is the crucial tipping point, the moment practicality overcomes prejudice. A design born of horse theft on the high plains is now being studied by generals in ornate uniforms, destined for standardization. This shift from outlaw tool to military necessities, the key irony in our story. Leading us directly into the official testing grounds of the Russian Empire, you are now standing in the heart of the Russian military machine, witnessing a truly remarkable transformation, the journey from outlaw to military procurement. Kusanov's design is no longer a tool of evasion. It is an object of intense bureaucratic scrutiny. The setting is likely a dusty, sprawling military depot in Omsk or Tashkent, sometime around the late 1880s. The process is slow, thorough, and utterly devoid of the romanticism of the steppes. A commission of severe-looking officers, veterinarians, and saddlery experts is assembled. Their goal is not to praise Kusanov, whose name is likely either unknown or quietly disregarded, but to determine if the design offers a measurable advantage over the heavy standard M1882 Dragoon saddle. The tests focus on two main criteria: equine endurance and rider combat readiness. For endurance, horses are weighed and measured, then ridden hundreds of miles carrying standardized military loads: rifle, ammunition, rations, blanket, and forage. The veterinarians track the horse's pulse, weight loss, and, most critically, the condition of its back. The results are stark. Horses, using the adapted steppe-style saddle, consistently show lower rates of saddle galling and can sustain a higher average daily mileage compared to those using traditional European models. The ability of the saddle's skeletal frame to create that essential central void, the air gap over the spines, proving its worth. For combi tradiness, troopers test the saddle's stability while performing maneuvers, dismounting quickly, firing rifles from the seat, and using sabers. The high pommel and cantle, which Kusanov designed for stability on the run, now translate perfectly into military advantages. They provide a stable platform for the rider to brace against, making the trooper a more effective fighting unit. The lightweight nature of the saddle also contributes to faster movement and less fatigue for both horse and rider. This administrative adoption is a mainstream historical fact. The superior performance of Central Asian saddle designs directly led to their eventual phased incorporation into various branches of the Russian Imperial Army, influencing later official models like the M1891. The irony here is delicious. The Russian state is essentially adopting a piece of equipment designed to outwit them. It's like the police force finally admits the fastest getaway car is the one developed by the local bank robbers. Imagine the budget meeting, comrades. We need to fund the Muhammad Kusanov saddle program. This shift underscores the relentless pragmatism of military procurement. Performance trumps pedigree every single time. A key challenge during this transition was manufacturing. Steppe saddles were usually handmade, tailored to the individual horse and rider. The Russians needed to mass-produce it to a standard template. This required replacing the intricate rawhide lacing of the original with more reliable factory-friendly methods, often using standardized steel bolts and stronger uniform wood. A necessary sacrifice of the original artisanal resilience for the sake of volume. Here's a quirky tidbit from the records. One of the early complaints about the steppe design, when first standardized by the Russian factories, was that the smooth, skeletal wooden seat, while perfect for weight distribution, caused excessive chafing on the rider's posterior if they wore thin or poorly tailored uniforms. The Cossacks had learned to layer heavy felt and sheepskin. The factory Russian troops had to adjust their personal padding solutions quickly, leading to a strange market for custom-made sheepskin saddle pads around military garrisons. Historians still argue whether the Russian decision to standardize a version of the steppe saddle was made primarily to increase the mobility of their forces against the nomadic resistance itself, which utilized the saddle masterfully, or whether it was a direct response to the larger geopolitical needs of the Great Game, the need to project force efficiently into disputed territories bordering British India. The efficiency gains served both purposes, of course, but the motivation speaks to the higher strategic stakes involved. By proving its worth in the grueling no-excuses environment of the frontier, Kusanov's innovation shed its outlaw origins and gained the stamp of imperial approval, ready now to be observed and copied by other global powers who were desperate for cavalry superiority. The ripples of a horse thief's necessity were about to cross oceans. You step away from the dusty Russian depot and into the rarefied air of international diplomacy and military strategy. The adoption of the steppe saddle design is not an isolated event. It's a critical response to the intense pressure cooker that was the Great Game's cavalry needs. This geopolitical struggle, the contest for influence in Central Asia between Imperial Russia and Victorian Britain, was essentially a race of endurance across immense, unforgiving landscapes. The Russian success depended on their ability to project power over vast distances, quickly and repeatedly. The traditional Russian cavalry, while numerous, was often hobbled by logistical constraints, particularly the rate at which their horses broke down. This directly hampered their strategic flexibility against the perceived British threat moving up from India. The British, operating in Afghanistan and the volatile frontier, faced similar equine challenges, although they relied more on lighter, modified English saddles and increasingly local designs. You realize the military urgency. If Russia could field cavalry capable of sustained multi-day high-speed movement without crippling its mounts, they gained a decisive strategic edge. The saddle derived from Kusanov's design was not just a piece of equipment, it was a force multiplier. It meant fewer animals required replacement, less time spent in veterinary hospitals, and a greater overall operational tempo. This necessity elevates the saddle's status from a local curiosity to a subject of global military interest. Every major European power maintained military attaches, officers specifically tasked with observing, documenting, and secretly reporting on the advancements and weaknesses of rival armies. These officers, often fluent in multiple languages and highly educated, would be embedded with Russian units, watching maneuvers and trials with hawk-like intensity. They weren't just looking at the size of the cannons or the color of the uniforms. They were looking at the logistics, the unsung mundane details like the design of a saddle or a canteen. It is a mainstream historical fact that military attaches and observer missions played a critical role in the transfer of technology and tactical doctrine between great powers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, often accelerating the global adoption of successful designs, including the centralized load saddle framework. The very success of the Russian units using the new saddle became its biggest advertisement. Reports would be secretly filed back to London, Berlin, and Paris. The Russians are achieving remarkable endurance from their horses, and we believe the key lies in their adopted Kyrgyz saddle design. Here's a quirky tidbit to try and throw off these foreign observers. The Russian quartermaster corps would sometimes purposefully deploy to different saddle models, the old standard and the new steppe-driven one end. However, the dramatic difference in the health and performance of the horses, even after superficial attempts at obfuscation, was always glaringly obvious to the trained eye of a foreign military expert. Trying to hide something that literally affects the way 500 horses look and move is a fool's errand. The stakes were immense. If the British could secure control over the vital trade routes or strategic passes like the Hindu Kush, Russia's southward expansion was checked. If Russia could move its troops quickly to reinforce garrisons or intercept British movements, the balance tilted the other way. The entire strategic calculation rested on the speed and stamina of their cavalry. Historians still argue whether the British, who had their own vast empire and constant colonial conflicts, should have adopted the steppe-style frame earlier, given their consistent reports from Central Asia. Their slower adoption may be attributed to deep-seated cultural biases, favoring traditional English saddle-making traditions, a classic example of cultural inertia impeding technological progress. It is in this atmosphere of tense observation and relentless one-upmanship that the design pioneered by a horse thief for personal survival is transformed into a state secret and a subject of intense industrial espionage. The saddle's superior performance was no longer merely about escaping capture. It was about the fate of empires. The next crucial step in this story happens when one of those keen-eyed military observers decides that this specific Russian innovation is exactly what his own nation, the United States, desperately needs. You are now immersed in the brutal reality of testing under fire. Early Russian trials. The adoption of Kusanov's design wasn't just a paper exercise. It was subjected to some of the most rigorous and unforgiving field tests in military history. The Russians understood that if the saddle was to be a strategic asset, it had to work flawlessly when lives depended on it. Picture yourself on a forced march in the Caucasus or Turkestan. You trudge alongside a column of Cossacks, the landscape shifting from baking dust to freezing mountainous terrain. The trials are designed not just to test the saddle, but to break the horses and see which equipment fails last. The orders are simple: ride for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, covering upwards of 120 kilometers, about 75 miles, and repeat this for weeks on end. The veterinarians, acting as objective judges, are key. Every evening, as the horses are unsaddled, the men inspect the animals' backs meticulously. They are looking for the telltale signs of trouble: heat, swelling, and the development of fistulas or galls. The traditional European saddles are failing within days. The lows-long trees and heavy padding trap, sweat and grit, creating abrasive surfaces that rapidly break the skin and cripple the horse. The steppe-driven saddle, however, is demonstrating remarkable resilience. Its high gullet keeps the spine clear, and the broad load-bearing sidebars distribute the rider and gear weight so effectively that the damage is minimized. The ability to use easily replaceable, thin layers of felt padding rather than fixed. Elaborate leather skirts means less trapped moisture and heat. It is a logistical revelation. This success quickly became a mainstream historical fact in military circles. The efficacy of the rigid, high-arched saddle frame in preventing equine back injuries under sustained heavy load conditions was empirically proven by the Russian Imperial Army's trials in Central Asia in the late 19th century. The testing wasn't just about distance, it was about combat. Troopers were required to fight mock skirmishes, using the saddle as a platform. Imagine swinging a heavy saber violently while galloping. The high cantle and pommel locked the rider in, allowing for more forceful, stable combat movements without the fear of being unseated or sliding off the back. The saddle became an extension of the rider, not just something they sat on. Here, as a quirky tidbit, illustrating the severity of the trials. At one point, during a test of endurance near the Persian border, the horses carrying the standard European saddles suffered such severe galls that the attending veterinarian ordered the saddles be padded with raw pieces of dried sheep intestine to act as a temporary slick barrier against the chafing. This bizarre temporary fix only underscored the utter failure of the traditional equipment compared to the naturally superior geometry of the Kazakh design. The Russian officers, initially skeptical of a design originating from nomadic savages, their term, not ours, and a clear example of cultural arrogance, were converted by the cold, hard data of equine health and operational tempo. They couldn't argue with a horse that was healthy and ready to ride again the next morning. Historians still argue whether the speed of the Russian adoption was primarily driven by the need to counter the Ottoman influence to the west, or the British influence to the south. While the great game was the grand backdrop, the practical necessity of being able to move a fighting force quickly across the unforgiving steppe proved to be the more immediate and compelling driver for the quartermaster corps. This rigorous testing established the saddle's bona fides. It was field-proven, battle-ready, and logistically sound. But, like any piece of effective military technology, it came with an added benefit that was perhaps overlooked at first: its supreme ability to handle not just the rider, but the pack they carried. This led to a separate, vital application that further cemented the design's global legacy. You stand watching the weary cavalry column halt for the night. As the riders begin to unsaddle, you notice something equally critical about Kusonov's design: its profound impact on the problem of the pack horse. In military logistics, transporting supplies and munition, rations, tents, medical kits is often a greater challenge than moving the men themselves. Traditionally, military supplies were loaded onto specific pack animals using bulky, non-rigid pack saddles, or simply lashed precariously to standard riding saddles. This often resulted in the load shifting a disaster on rough terrain. If a pack slips, the horse is thrown off balance, potentially causing injury to the animal and certainly delaying the entire column while the load is awkwardly restored. Imagine an entire regiment waiting because a bag of beans slipped off a mule. Kusonov's saddle, with its high rigid pommel and cantle, provided an unintended but perfect solution for load bearing. The skeletal wooden frame, designed to lift the rider's weight off the horse's spine, was structurally sound enough to also handle the heavy, asymmetrical weight of military equipment. The load could be secured easily and rigidly to the high arches of the tree, distributing the weight evenly across the horse's strong back muscles, exactly as the rider's weight was distributed. This adaptability meant that, in a pinch, any horse in the column could be quickly converted from a riding mount to a reliable pack animal without needing a separate, specialized pack saddle. This logistical flexibility was a game-changer. It is a mainstream historical fact that the versatility of the high-arched, rigid tree saddle, its dual capability as a riding and packing platform, significantly improved the logistical efficiency of 19th-century military campaigns, particularly in rough or roadless terrain. You observe the Cossacks using the saddle. They attach side pouches and lashing rings directly to the strong wooden bars of the saddle tree. Because the tree is rigid and sits clear of the spine, the load is inherently stable. It doesn't shift, rub, or slide, which means less time spent adjusting gear and more time spent moving forward. This ability to carry a stable, heavy load, often up to 100 pounds of gear, in addition to the rider, without compromising the horse's health, was the final piece of evidence needed to secure the saddle's military future. Here's a quirky tidbit related to the saddle's packing capability. During maneuvers, Russian field cooks found that they could suspend large, heavy copper kettles for making stew or kasha directly from the high pommel of the saddle tree, distributing the weight on either side. This was notoriously inefficient and caused the horse to sway oddly. But it was a testament to the fact that the saddle tree was seen as the most robust piece of load-bearing equipment they possessed. This practicality did not go unnoticed by the foreign military observers. They understood that the difference between victory and defeat often lay not with the cavalry charge, but with the ability to ensure the soldiers had food, ammunition, and fresh horses 3 weeks into a campaign. The saddle wasn't just fixing the injury problem, it was solving the sustained supply problem. Historians still argue whether the design was copied more for its benefit to the rider, or its benefit to the logistics, that is, its superior ability to securely carry heavy, uneven loads over long distances. Given the vast logistical failures of many 19th century armies, its packing capability likely sealed the deal for many procurement boards. As these foreign observers documented the stunning performance and versatility of the Russian-adopted design, the story of the Kazakh horse thief's innovation began its true global journey. The reports detailing the high arches and load stability were packed into diplomatic bags, destined for capitals across Europe and eventually across the Atlantic. You are now in a quiet, paneled office in Berlin or London, a stark contrast to the vast windswept steppes. You are reviewing the documents passed through intelligence channels, the meticulous reports filed by European military attaches. Their interest in the Russian cavalry was not casual, it was strategic. These highly trained officers, often having studied military science and horsemanship at elite academies, recognized the profound implication of the Russian saddle's success. The reports focused relentlessly on the structural difference. They drew detailed diagrams comparing the low, heavily padded English hunting saddle or the French cuirassier saddle with the newly adopted Russian model. The key takeaway, documented in cold, hard prose, was the physics, the step design, or what they often termed the Turkic-style pattern. Minimized friction and distributed pressure over a much larger, less sensitive surface area of the horse's back. Germany, France, and Britain were all powers engaged in colonial expansion and facing the constant need for rapid, sustained troop movement over difficult terrain. The Franco-Prussian War was still a recent memory, and the importance of mobile, functional cavalry had not yet diminished. If Russia had found a way to double the effective marching distance of their horses, the other powers had to pay attention. This moment marks the transition of Kusanov's design from a regional oddity to an internationally sought-after military technology. This observation period highlights a mainstream historical fact. The late 19th century was an era of intense competitive military modernization, where successful innovations in one country, especially those related to mobility and logistics, were rapidly copied, adapted, and integrated into the armies of rival nations. You see the attaches detailed sketches. They meticulously note the high arch of the pommel, the front, the deep curve of the cantle, the rear, and the narrow, rigid wooden sidebars. They are less concerned with the crude rawhide origins and more with the standardized, manufactured Russian version. But the fundamental geometry is the same. They understand that this skeletal frame is the engine of its success. Here's a quirky tidbit from the German reports. One Prussian officer, observing a demonstration, noted that the Russian troopers seemed to sit higher and more stiffly than was customary, leading him to hypothesize incorrectly that the saddle was designed to intimidate. He failed to realize that the height was merely a necessary consequence of creating the vital space over the spine. It was an engineering requirement, not a psychological tactic. His cultural bias almost led him to dismiss a breakthrough technology as a mere parade piece. The European armies began their own adaptations almost immediately. The British, ever conservative, eventually modified their existing colonial saddles, deepening the seat and raising the pommel slightly, though often not going as far as the Russian design. The Germans and French also experimented, sometimes developing overly complex versions, trying to combine the step frame with their own heavy leather traditions. Historians still argue whether the European powers' relatively slow and partial adoption compared to the Russians and later the Americans was due to the political influence of established, traditional saddlery firms in their home countries who naturally favored their own existing profitable designs, or simply the lack of truly vast continuous terrain in Western Europe that would demand the extreme endurance provided by the skeletal frame. However, the most decisive link in the chain of transmission was an American. His mission was simple: find the best military technology the world had to offer and bring it home. He would take the basic design, already proven by a Kazakh horse thief and formalized by the Tsar, and usher it onto the world stage. You are now introduced to the crucial intermediary in this global story, Captain Charles B.S. Scott, a U.S. Army officer. It is the late 1890s, and Scott, a sharp and pragmatic man, has been assigned the task of evaluating the newest military equipment being used by foreign powers. His mandate is simple: bring back whatever works best. His journey takes him through Europe and eventually into the Russian Empire, where he is specifically looking for solutions to the chronic problems plaguing the U.S. cavalry. The American cavalry, engaged in constant patrol and conflict across the vast Western territories, was suffering from the same logistical nightmare as the Russians had. Crippling equine injuries, the standard American issue, the famous McClellan saddle, while an improvement over earlier designs, still sat too low on the horse's back and frequently caused those debilitating galls and sores, especially on long, hard campaigns. The horses were breaking down faster than they could be replaced. Captain Scott, witnessing the Russian trials firsthand, was immediately struck not by the Cossacks' fighting prowess, but by the remarkable condition of their horses after grueling forced marches. He wasn't relying on diplomatic rumors. He was looking at hard, verifiable data. The lack of veterinary issues in the units equipped with the steppe-driven saddle. This was the defining moment where the design, born of a Kazakh horse thief's necessity, was scientifically validated by a foreign military. Scott's reports back to the U.S. Ordnance Department were likely dry and technical, but his conclusion was revolutionary. The current American saddle was fundamentally flawed, and the solution lay with the Kyrgyz pattern being used by the Russians. He dedicated significant time to studying the Russian-manufactured version of Kusanov's design, documenting its precise dimensions, the materials used in its skeletal saddle tree, and the methods for affixing loads. This transition marks a mainstream historical fact. The U.S. military often relied on the observations of dedicated officers like Captain Scott to procure and integrate foreign innovations. Scott was not an inventor. He was a highly efficient technology scout, recognizing superior performance when he saw it, regardless of its humble or foreign origins. What Scott was witnessing was the culmination of Kusanov's genius, the ability to decouple the load from the spine. Scott saw a saddle that wasn't just better than the McClellan, he saw a saddle that was fundamentally different in its engineering philosophy. The McClellan was designed for lightweight movement. The Russian saddle was designed for sustained, heavy load-bearing without injury. Here's a quirky tidbit about Scott's meticulous work. He didn't just take measurements. He insisted on getting the specific recipes for the leather treatment and wood preservation used by the Russian saddlers, trying to understand not just the geometry, but the material resilience. He noted in his private papers that the Russian version, despite being manufactured in a factory, still retained a certain brute simplicity that he found highly appealing for the harsh conditions of the American West. Historians still argue whether Scott's enthusiasm was entirely driven by the Russian trials, or if he had already been influenced by similar high-cantel saddles used by the Mexican vaqueros, or indigenous peoples in the American Southwest, which also employed similar principles of spinal clearance. However, it was the formal Russian standardization that gave him the statistical proof he needed to push the design through the U.S. bureaucracy. Captain Scott's belief in the design was so strong that he did unjust write a report. He secured a sample saddle and committed to personally championing its adoption, knowing full well he would face stiff resistance from a military establishment deeply attached to its own traditions, especially the long-serving but flawed McClellan. His next step was to subject himself and the saddle to the ultimate personal test. You follow Captain Scott as he undertakes the most critical phase of his mission, the personal trial. You witness his initial skepticism and conversion firsthand. Scott was a cavalry officer, steeped in American tradition, familiar with the McClellan saddle, and likely harbored a natural professional bias toward his own service's equipment. His skepticism was genuine. Could a crude design, refined by an empire he viewed as slightly backward, truly outperform the products of American industrial might? Scott secured a version of the Russian modified steppe saddle, the one ultimately derived from Kusanov's geometry, and subjected it to the ultimate test, a grueling multi-day long-distance maneuver designed to replicate the punishing conditions of the American plains. This wasn't a parade ground exercise, this was a test of survival for the horse and endurance for the man. Imagine the sight, Scott, riding alongside Russian or Cossack troopers, clocking dozens of miles a day. He is carrying a full field kit, including his personal gear and the weight of his observational equipment. Initially, he struggles to adapt. The saddle feels different, taller, more skeletal, and less yielding than the familiar leather-covered McClellan. He might have felt perched precariously high, requiring a different balance and posture. But as the days turn into a week, the undeniable truth emerges in the state of his mount. Every night, while horses ridden with traditional saddles are exhibiting signs of fatigue, localized swelling, and the beginnings of galls, Scott's horse, carrying the steppe-style frame, is remarkably sound. The skepticism gives way to firm conviction. Scott realizes that the initial discomfort he felt as a rider was a small price to pay for the massive gain in equine health. The design's core engineering principle, the high, rigid tree that acts as a suspension bridge, was proven undeniable by the condition of the animal beneath him. The minimal contact and maximized spinal clearance prevented the pressure points that crippled other horses. This crucial period of testing is a mainstream historical fact. The U.S. Army's decision to adopt a fundamentally new saddle design was directly predicated on the empirically proven success of the Russian-Kazakh pattern in reducing equine casualties during extended field trials observed by American officers. Scott's conversion was total. He became the design's most vocal champion. He understood that this saddle offered a military advantage that transcended mere comfort. It offered sustainable speed and reach. The ability to avoid veterinary downtime was an exponential force multiplier. The design, originating from the desperate need of a horse thief to always have a fresh, ready mount, was now seen as the key to U.S. cavalry efficiency. Here, as a quirky tidbit about the transition, American cavalry officers had a deep-seated belief that a proper rider should be able to feel the horse's back through the saddle for better communication. The high, rigid Kusanov-style tree made this tactile connection much harder, leading many old-school officers to complain that the new saddle was too unresponsive and foreign. Scott had to patiently argue that the priority was the horse's longevity, not the rider's sensory experience. Historians still argue whether the U.S. would have eventually developed a similar arched skeletal saddle independently, perhaps influenced by the Mexican vaquero saddles already common in the Southwest. However, the influence of Scott's direct observation of the proven mass-produced Russian version undoubtedly accelerated the adoption process by decades. With his conviction solidified, Scott now faced the formidable task of convincing a deeply conservative U.S. Ordnance Board. He packed the sample saddle, a physical testament to a horse thief's genius, and began the long journey home to America. His advocacy was about to run straight into the brick wall of tradition and bureaucracy. You are now aboard a steamer, crossing the Atlantic, accompanying Captain Scott and the most important piece of baggage he carries, the steppe-driven Russian saddle. You are tracking its journey to the U.S. Ordnance Board. The arrival in the United States marks the transition of the design from a practical field solution to a bureaucratic problem. Scott's challenge was immense. He wasn't just presenting a new piece of equipment, he was challenging the status quo, which in the U.S. Army was the entrenched and somewhat revered McClellan saddle. The McClellan, though flawed, had history. It symbolized American cavalry tradition, having served through the Civil War and the subsequent Western campaigns. Any replacement would have to pass extreme scrutiny from officers fiercely loyal to the old ways who might view a Russian design with suspicion, if not outright contempt. Scott's presentation to the Ordnance Board was not built on personal anecdotes, but on the cold, hard data he collected in Central Asia. He brought veterinary reports, endurance statistics, and, most importantly, the physical saddle itself. He likely used the term Scott saddle, or improved cavalry saddle, to distance it slightly from its foreign origins, focusing instead on its proven efficacy. He demonstrated how the high, rigid saddle treat the skeletal heart of Kusanov's design distributed weight over the horse's longissimus dorsi muscles, thus preventing the crippling spinal and wither pressure that was endemic with the low-slung McClellan. And the impetus for change came from officers like Scott, who observed superior ergonomic principles in foreign designs. The board, composed largely of engineers and conservative military procurement specialists, likely focused on manufacturability, they needed assurance that the robust, almost primitive wooden frame could be mass-produced efficiently and uniformly in American factories. The design's simplicity, its reliance on a strong, fundamental wooden structure rather than complex leatherwork and padding was, ironically, its saving grace in this context. It lent itself well to standardized high-volume production. Here, as a quirky tidbit from the likely boardroom environment. One of the initial points of contention from a senior officer was not about the horse's back, but about the high cantle. He argued that it prevented the cavalrymen from easily reaching the horse's tail. Crude field habits some troopers had for bracing themselves or temporarily tying equipment. Scott likely had to politely explain that the horse's longevity was more important than a trooper's ill-advised field habit. The sheer volume of data, Scott presented the reduced incidence of saddle galls, and the increased speed and endurance of the Russian-ridden horses could not be ignored. It was a clear mathematical advantage. The design was adopted not because it was beautiful or traditional, but because it was logistically superior. Historians still argue whether the Ordnance Board was truly convinced by Scott's data alone, or if the simultaneous failures of U.S. cavalry logistics during the Spanish-American War 1898, which highlighted the poor condition of mounts, rushed into service, provided the necessary political momentum to finally abandon the flawed McClellan design. Both factors undoubtedly played a role in the sudden willingness to embrace radical change. The board gave the go-ahead, but with a caveat. The design would need to be slightly modified to fit American manufacturing processes, materials, and specific cavalry preferences, a necessary yet crucial step that would refine the horse thief's original genius into a piece of truly standardized military equipment. You move into the American workshops, observing the process of the 1904 modification, adapting for the West. The U.S. Ordnance Department accepted the core engineering principle. Scott presented the rigid, high-arched tree butt. Standardization required revisions. The goal was to maintain Kusanov's spinal clearing geometry while making the saddle compatible with American manufacturing capabilities and the specific equipment used by the U.S. cavalry. The Russian version was, by design, slightly heavier and sometimes inconsistent in its construction. Relying on field-ready materials, the American engineers sought to refine this. They standardized the materials, primarily using high-grade hickory or oak for the saddle tree, to ensure maximum strength and uniformity. They also incorporated metal hardware steel plates, rivets, and stirrup components, where the Kazakh original had used rawhide lacing. This switch increased manufacturing speed and ensured a longer, more predictable service life, though it sacrificed the organic field repairability of the original. The most visible change involved the addition of standardized fittings. Rings and slots were engineered directly into the wooden tree and the later leather coverings, making it easier to attach official military gear carbines, saddlebags, and blanket rolls in a consistent manner. Crucially, they designed a system of quarter straps and rigging that more reliably secured the saddle to the horse, while ensuring the weight remained distributed correctly. A critical technical detail often overlooked in simpler step designs. This adaptation process is a mainstream historical fact. The Americanization of the foreign design resulted in a hybrid saddle that retained the key ergonomic geometry of the Central Asian saddle. Tree-butt was executed with the higher material standards and manufacturing precision of early 20th century U.S. industrial production. You see the engineers grappling with the minor adjustments needed to accommodate the slightly different conformation of American cavalry horses compared to the smaller, hardier Central Asian breeds. The gullet clearance, the vital air gap over the spine, had to be precise, as the width and arch of the horse's withers varied. The final design, while standardized, allowed for a limited amount of adjustable padding to fit individual horses, a compromise between mass production and field practicality. Here's a quirky tidbit about the U.S. modification. During the initial adaptation period, one engineer suggested adding a small recessed compartment inside the wooden cantle arch, accessible from the underside, specifically for storing veterinary ointments or small tools. The idea was eventually scrapped as impractical for mass production, but it shows how thoroughly they were trying to integrate the concept of field maintenance into the design. The modified design, refined from Kasunov's original concept, was finally ready for official adoption. It was a moment of profound, if quiet, historical irony. A technology perfected by an outlaw on the other side of the world was about to become the backbone of the U.S. military's mounted capability. Historians still argue whether the US engineers should have fully credited the Russian, and by extension, the Kazakh origin of the design. While Captain Scott's reports acknowledged the debt, the final designation largely obscured the foreign influence, perhaps to make its acceptance easier for a nationalistic military establishment, a common practice in military technological adoption. The stage was set for the saddle to receive its official, if slightly misleading, designation. Locking its fate into the annals of American military history and beginning its long, distinguished service life, you witness the final act of this strange journey, the official adoption of the design. In 1904, the U.S. Army formally approved the modified Stepadorivt saddle, designating it the Standard Saddle, model of 1904. But here lies a piece of profound bureaucratic irony. Instead of naming it the Scott Saddle or the 1904 Standard, the official designation was quickly shifted to the McClellan Saddle, model 1904. You realize the irony is twofold. First, the new saddle was adopted precisely because the old McClellan saddle was fundamentally flawed in crippled horses. Second, the two saddles share almost no design DNA, apart from perhaps the central hole in the seat leather. Kusanov's design, built on the principle of a high, rigid, skeletal tree, was the complete antithesis of the old low-slung McClellan. Yet, the name stuck. Why the retained name? The answer lies in military conservatism and politics. The name McClellan carried historical weight, evoking the tradition of the American Civil War, cavalry, and the romance of the West. It was deemed politically and psychologically easier to introduce a radically new design under the banner of a familiar, respected name than to admit the Army was adopting a design based on observations of a Russian-adopted, Kazakh-engineered innovation. It was a marketing trick, plain and simple. Sell the revolutionary change with a comforting traditional brand name. This standard issue, the M1904 McClellan saddle, is a mainstream historical fact. The U.S. Army adopted a saddle in 1904 that was structurally and ergonomically based on Central Asian principles, yet retained the name of the previous failed American design for reasons of institutional continuity and convenience. This new M1904, with its high pommel and cantel, its rigid wooden tree, and its superior weight distribution, quickly demonstrated its efficacy on the American frontier and in campaigns like the punitive expedition into Mexico. The reduced veterinary reports and the improved stamina of the cavalry horses were the silent, yet most convincing evidence of the Kazakh horse thieves' lasting contribution. You look closely at the saddle as it is being manufactured. It's a study in efficient skeletal design. The sidebars are wide and smooth, perfectly contoured to rest on the horse's back muscles. The seat itself is just a sling of leather stretched tightly between the pommel and the cantle, which forces the rider's weight down onto those load-bearing sidebars. It is simple, functional, and built for war and endurance, not comfort or show. Here's a quirky tidbit about the naming. The Army briefly considered calling a prototype the Scott McClellan, but dropped the dual name as too cumbersome. Scott, the pragmatic officer, likely didn't care about the credit. He cared only that the horses were no longer being crippled. The true genius, Muhammad Kusanov, remained completely unknown to the men who rode on his design. Historians still argue whether the retention of the McClellan name ultimately slowed the acceptance of the design by some traditionalist regiments, who believed the M1904 was simply a padded version of the old McClellan rather than a total redesign based on superior foreign engineering. Regardless of the name, the physical form of the saddle had arrived. It was now standard equipment. And its core design philosophy, the principles Kusanov intuitively mastered on the run, was ready to be deployed across the globe. The journey of the skeletal tree was complete. You take a moment to distill the essence of Kusanov's genius, now enshrined in the U.S. Army's M1904 saddle. You are examining the saddle's core design philosophy, the fundamental principles that elevate it from a mere seat to a piece of sophisticated orthopedic engineering for the horse. The entire philosophy hinges on one concept: unloading the spine. The horse's spine, particularly the thoracic vertebrae beneath the withers, is strong for vertical rigidity but surprisingly susceptible to concentrated vertical pressure and the friction caused by a shifting load. Kusanov instinctively understood that the load must be borne by the large, powerful muscles running alongside the spine, the longissimus dorsi, and related muscle groups which are designed to support and move the body's weight. The saddle accomplishes this through its rigid, skeletal saddle tree. This wooden frame acts like a bridge or a suspension system. It has minimal contact with the horse, limited only to the broad, flat sidebars that run parallel to the spine. These sidebars distribute the rider S-weight and the gear S-weight over a maximum surface area of those load-bearing muscles. The more area the weight is spread across, the lower the pressure per square inch, and the less likely the horse is to develop those crippling saddle galls. This is a mainstream historical fact. The shift from low-contact, highly padded saddles to rigid, high-contact surface frames the saddle tree represented a paradigm shift in equestrian ergonomics, moving from trying to cushion the blow to distributing the force efficiently. Look at the structure again. The high pommel and cantle are not just for the rider's comfort. They are structural necessities. They are the twin pillars that hold the bridge the sidebars aloft, ensuring that the central channel, the gullet, remains entirely clear of the horse's spine. Even when the horse's back flexes dramatically under load or when the rider moves suddenly. Here, as a quirky tidbit illustrating the importance of distribution. Early saddles that tried to use soft padding instead of a rigid tree often created an opposite problem. The padding would compress unevenly, creating more pressure points where the material bunched up or where the rider's weight naturally concentrated, making the saddle worse than a simple bareback ride. Kusanov's design forced pressure away from the center and evenly outward. The other core principle is minimizing trapped heat and moisture. The skeletal design meant there was less bulky material covering the horse's back. Less material meant better airflow, allowing sweat to evaporate more quickly. Trapped moisture and heat are major contributors to skin damage and galls. The simple felt or blanket layers used beneath the tree could be easily removed, dried and cleaned, vastly improving hygiene and reducing friction. Historians still argue whether the high cantle's primary function, from an engineering perspective, was to brace the rider against the shock of weapon recoil, common in cavalry combat, or if it was simply to complete the structural rigidity of the suspension bridge design. In truth, it achieved both goals masterfully. This refined M1904 saddle, a descendant of the step saddle, carried its fundamental engineering philosophy, minimalism, rigidity, and strategic load-bearing directly into the 20th century. However, the true measure of its success lies not in the rider's comfort, but in the sustained health of the horse, especially around the most vulnerable spot, the withers. You shift your perspective now, getting low to the ground, to appreciate the saddle-S genius from the animal-S point of view, the horse-S perspective, avoiding wither damage. If Kusanov's design has a single life-saving function, it is the protection of the horse's withers and the spine directly beneath them. The withers are the highest point of the horse's back, formed by the spinous processes of the thoracic vertebrae. This area is extremely sensitive because the bone is very close to the skin, with minimal muscle or fat padding to cushion against pressure. This is precisely the area where poorly designed saddles, especially those that sit low on the horse's back or shift laterally, cause the most severe and debilitating injuries, the notorious wither galls. The high-arched skeletal design, which you've tracked from the steps to the American M1904, systematically prevents this damage. The rigid wooden pommel, the front arch, is engineered to soar high above the withers, creating that vital gullet clearance that acts as an air gap and a structural shield. Even when the horse descends a steep slope, forcing the saddle forward, or when it violently bucks or twists, the solid frame ensures that no weight or frictional pressure is applied to that sensitive bony region. This feature is a mainstream historical fact, and the primary reason the design was adopted globally. By ensuring complete spinal and wither clearance, the high-arched saddle tree drastically reduced the incidence of crippling injuries, extending the service life and operational readiness of cavalry horses from months to years. Imagine the traditional saddle as a heavy brick resting directly on the horse. Kusanov's design is a suspension bridge. The load is transferred to the strong foundation, the longissimus dorsi muscles, and held clear of the vulnerable roadway, the spine. This structural integrity is maintained even when the rider shifts their weight dramatically, because the entire saddle tree is a rigid unit. Here, as a quirky tidbit illustrating the extreme lengths people went to protect the withers before this design became popular. In some older European armies, saddlers would carve thick, ornate leather padding, specifically designed to attempt to fill the space around the withers. This often backfired. When the horse sweated, the leather would shrink, harden, and compressed, exacerbating the friction and causing even worse sores than if the saddle had been slightly loose. Kusanov's solution was to use nothing to ensure zero contact, a far more effective answer. It's a classic engineering lesson. Sometimes the best solution is the one with the fewest parts. The ability to avoid these injuries meant fewer horses were retired early, a huge economic and logistical advantage. For a horse thief like Mukemde Kusanov, it meant he didn't need to steal a new horse every few weeks. His existing mount remained fit, fresh, and ready to ride hard. For the military, it meant a massive saving in time, resources, and manpower required for animal care. Historians still argue whether the high-arched saddle tree should be classified primarily as an innovation in human load distribution or in veterinary preventative medicine. In reality, the design seamlessly integrated both, proving that effective human engineering must always align with the biological limits of the non-human systems it relies upon. By ensuring the longevity and health of the horse, Kusanov's design, now standardized as the M1904, was ready for its ultimate test, the global conflict that would demand unimaginable equine endurance and efficiency. You are now swept into the maelstrom of the early 20th century. The high-arched saddle, in various national adaptations, is about to face its ultimate trial, World War I's proving ground. While the nature of the war rapidly shifted to trench warfare, the initial and sustained cavalry movements on the Eastern Front in the Middle East, and even the rapid deployment phases on the Western Front, demanded unimaginable equine endurance. The saddles designed the direct descendant of Kusanov's geometry proved essential. The US M1904, the rebranded McClellan, the Russian M1891, and similar skeletal frame designs adopted or adapted by German, Austrian, and British forces, particularly for colonial units, all relied on the fundamental principle of spinal clearance and weight distribution. Horses were pushed past their limits, often covering hundreds of miles with minimal rest, carrying men and massive loads of warfighting gear. In this environment of attrition, the design that reduced veterinary downtime was a clear winner. The simple act of preventing saddle galls meant that a regiment could maintain its operational strength longer than a regiment using older, traditional equipment. In the massive maneuvers across the plains of Poland or the deserts of Mesopotamia, the ability to keep horses healthy was the single biggest logistical factor outside of forage itself. This utility in the Great War is a mainstream historical fact. The high-arched rigid tree saddle designs proved superior for military applications requiring extreme endurance and heavy load-bearing, cementing their status as the dominant functional design for cavalry worldwide. You realize that Kusanov's design, intended for a lone thief's survival, was now being mass-produced by factories in dozens of nations, its principles applied to save the state millions in horse replacement costs. The irony is staggering. The very empires that would have scorned a steppe bandit were now relying on his engineering intuition to fight the modern war. Here, a quirky tidbit about WWI logistics. The demand for horses was so immense that the US alone shipped over 1 million horses and mules to Europe during the conflict. The fact that the US had standardized the M1904 saddle, based on the steppe design, meant that the horses arriving in Europe were equipped with a saddle that gave them the best possible chance of surviving the grueling transport and the immediate demands of frontline duty. Imagine the supply chain meeting. Ship the horses, but for God's sake, make sure they have the horse thief's saddle. Even as machine guns and artillery made the mounted charge increasingly suicidal on the Western Front, cavalry remained vital for reconnaissance, skirmishing, and pursuit on the vast Eastern Front and in colonial theaters. In these regions, where logistical support was minimal and terrain was unforgiving, the saddle's resilience and its packing capability, remember the ability to carry heavy, asymmetric loads, were absolutely indispensable. Historians still argue whether the dominance of the high-arched saddle in WWI actually prolonged the operational utility of cavalry, or whether its effectiveness merely bought a few more years for an obsolescent branch of service before mechanized transport completely took over. Regardless, it was the best possible equipment for the job at the time. As the war ended, the age of the mounted cavalry charge was drawing to a close, but the physical saddle, the rigid wooden tree, was far from retired. Its proven resilience and unmatched ergonomic efficiency ensured its survival, not just in military storehouses, but in a very different, yet equally demanding environment: the American West. The The roar of the Great War's artillery fades, but the sturdy silhouette of the high-arched saddle remains, transitioning into the enduring cavalry tradition. You witness a strange phenomenon. The equipment, far from being discarded as obsolete, is retained precisely because it solved the fundamental problem of the horse-rider interface better than anything else. Even as armies began to fully motorize their transport, the cavalry branch didn't vanish overnight. Many nations, including the US, maintained mounted units for border patrol, rough terrain, reconnaissance, and ceremonial duties well into the 1930s and beyond. The US Army, for instance, continued to use the M1904 and later the M1928, a minor variant, as standard issue until the official disestablishment of the mounted cavalry in 1942. This longevity is a testament to the saddle's superior function. The design became a symbol of equestrian hardiness and reliability. Because the saddle was engineered for sustained, heavy-duty work in punishing conditions, it was inherently adaptable. When a horse was no longer needed for a saber charge, it was still needed to carry a radio, rations, or a wounded comrade over mountains or through deep canyons. The design's ability to handle asymmetric and heavy loads, inherited directly from Kusanov's steppe experience, ensured its continued relevance long after the age of the horse soldier was theoretically over. This persistence is a mainstream historical fact. The US Army's reliance on the M1904, M1928 saddle designs until World War II illustrates the functional superiority of the rigid high-arched frame for the specific military tasks of patrol and logistics, even as the horse's role diminished. You might see a US cavalry officer in the 1930s, a time of cars and airplanes still, riding on a saddle whose fundamental geometry was developed by a Kazakh horse thief 50 years earlier. That officer probably never once considered the saddle's origins. He only knew that his horse remained sound and could carry him reliably across the rough terrain of Texas or Arizona. Here's a quirky tidbit about the saddle's post-cavalry life. When the US military finally sold off its massive inventory of M1904, M1928 saddles after World War II, many were purchased by organizations that still relied on horses for hard work, such as the US Forest Service and various state police mounted units. These organizations knew that for demanding all-day duty in the backwoods, there was simply no more reliable piece of equipment for keeping a horse healthy. They weren't buying military history, they were buying proven veterinary engineering. The tradition wasn't just military, it filtered into the civilian world. People who worked horses for a living, those who needed a saddle built for 10 hours a day, every day recognized its utility. Historians still argue whether the longevity of the steppe-derived design was due more to its structural simplicity and low-maintenance requirements, making it cheap and durable, or its unparalleled ergonomic benefit to the animal. It's likely both, a perfect synergy of cost efficiency and performance. This leads us to the saddle's next great phase of adoption. As the military relinquished the design, it was eagerly seized upon by a different breed of rugged professional, the American stockman and cowboy, who required the same resilience Kusanov did. You now observe the saddle's migration from the barracks to the bunkhouse. The sturdy skeletal design, proven by the armies of the world, found a new and equally demanding home in the American West, as it became the saddle of choice for the stockman's adoption. Ranches and rodeos. As the US Army decommissioned its vast supply of M1904 and M1928 saddles after World War II, they were sold as military surplus. Cowboys, ranchers, and stockmen, who needed gear that could withstand the brutality of all-day high-speed ranch work, immediately recognized the superiority of the rigid frame. Unlike the older, heavy, and overly ornate civilian saddles, the military surplus offered the proven ergonomic advantage necessary for their version of sustained operational tempo, riding thousands of acres, roping cattle, and covering long distances without crippling their quarter horses or mules. The primary appeal was the saddle's skeletal tree, the core structure derived from Kusanov's genius. The high pommel and cantle, which locked the rider into place during a cavalry charge, now served to brace the cowboy against the violent shock of a roped steer hitting the end of a line. The superior weight distribution meant the saddle could handle the load of the rider, plus the heavy ropes, chaps, and tools necessary for ranch work, all without causing back damage to the working animal. This is a mainstream historical fact. The US Army surplus of McClellan M1904, M1928 Saddles was heavily utilized by post-war ranchers and served as a direct influence on the standardization of the durable hypomel, roping saddles common in the Western industry today. You notice how the stockmen, much like the Russian Cossacks before them, adapted the basic design. They replaced the military's simple leather seat sling with thick civilian leather and often added more padding to the seat itself for comfort during those marathon days. They often kept the rigging simple and robust, favoring the strength and durability of the military-grade wood and metal tree over the softer, more decorative civilian trees. Here's a quirky tidbit about the rodeo connection. The high cantle of the saddle, designed to keep a soldier in during rapid maneuvers, was quickly embraced by early rodeo riders. It provided superior bracing and stability, especially in rough stock events like bronco riding. While modern bucking saddles are specialized, the fundamental high-backed bracing concept can be traced back to these rugged military surplus saddles adopted from the steppe design. It's a funny thought. A horse thief's necessity contributes to the spectacle of a weekend rodeo. This widespread civilian use cemented the saddle's longevity. It transitioned from a specific military tool into a universally accepted design for hard work. It demonstrated that for any profession requiring a horse to perform sustained heavy-duty labor over difficult terrain, the principle of the high-arched rigid tree design was non-negotiable. Historians still argue whether the high-arched, deep-seated design of the modern Western saddle was influenced more by the Spanish-Mexican tradition of vaquero saddles, or by the influx of durable U.S. Army surplus based on the steppe design. In reality, both forms shared the common principle of protecting the horse's spine and providing the rider stability, making the military surplus a perfect high-quality bridge between old and new styles. The influence of Muhammad Kusanov's simple engineering was no longer confined to military logistics. It was now the silent structural hero of the American cowboy, extending the reach and endurance of the entire Western cattle industry. The next logical step is to see how this fundamental structure, the saddle tree, influenced every saddle that came after. You are now examining the ultimate legacy of Kusanov's design, the global impact of the tree. The skeletal frame, or saddle tree, born on the steppes and standardized by the American military, is arguably the single most important innovation in equestrian equipment since the stirrup. The core geometry, high gullet, rigid sidebars, and spinal clearance became the mandatory blueprint for virtually all subsequent working and military saddle designs worldwide. The influence wasn't merely on the U.S. Army. As other nations modernized their cavalry and sought to maximize equine performance, they either directly copied the features of the M1904 or adopted very similar high-arched designs, often referred to generically as stock or treeless, a misnomer as they were the opposite of treeless saddles. The principle of the rigid tree as a load distributor rather than a mere seat was a technological idea that could not be unlearned. This profound influence on design is a mainstream historical fact. The rigid high-arched saddle tree, as popularized through the Russian and American military models of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, established the engineering standard for modern working saddles across all continents, including the Australian stock saddle and most contemporary Western riding saddles. The key component they all share is the geometry of the tree. If you look at a cutting-edge custom-made Western saddle today, you will see a sophisticated, often expensive version of Kusanov's simple wooden frame. The width of the gullet, the flare of the bars, and the angle of the cantle are all modern calculations aimed at perfecting the principle discovered by the horse thief. Maximize the bearing surface over the longissimus dorsi muscles, while maintaining zero pressure on the spine and withers. Here's a quirky tidbit about the tree's global spread. After WWI, many saddle makers in places like Argentina and South Africa, which had large mounted police and military units, began importing American military surplus saddles specifically to study and reverse engineer the saddle tree dimensions. They realized that the standardized rigid tree was the most reliable foundation for any heavy-duty equestrian work, whether it was herding ganado or patrolling the veldt. The saddle tree became the unsung hero of equestrian durability. You might pay thousands of dollars for the beautiful leatherwork and silver ornamentation on a custom saddle, but you are primarily paying for the precisely engineered fiberglass or wooden draw-wide tree underneath, which determines the comfort and longevity of your horse. If that underlying tree fails, the saddle is useless and, worse, dangerous to the horse. Historians still argue whether the high-arched saddle tree could be considered a true parallel invention that arose independently in multiple high-endurance equestrian cultures, like Central Asia and the American Southwest, or if the global standardization of the design was primarily a top-down effect driven by the copying of successful military technology. The evidence points to the latter for mass adoption, even if the general concept existed elsewhere. From humble origins on the vast, desperate plains of Kazakhstan, the saddle's influence has permeated the very structure of equestrian life globally. But in the modern world, even the wood and rawhide of the original design have been overtaken by new materials, leading to the next stage of its evolution. You peer into the modern saddlery workshop, a world away from Kusinova's steppe encampment, and examine modern manufacturing and materials. The principles of the design remain exactly the same, the high-arched, rigid, spinal-clearing tree, but the execution has evolved dramatically, thanks to 20th and to 1st century technology. Today, the core of the saddle, the tree, is rarely made from simple, rawhide-wrapped wood. Instead, it is typically molded from synthetic materials. You see trees made from hedon-city polymers, fiberglass, or even sophisticated carbon fiber composites. These materials offer several advantages over the original birch and rawhide. They are perfectly uniform, significantly lighter, impervious to moisture and rot, and can be manufactured to incredibly precise, measurable specifications. This precision is vital for optimizing load distribution across the horse's back. This evolution is a mainstream historical fact. The primary change in saddle design over the last century has been the substitution of traditional organic materials, wood, rawhide with lightweight, high-strength synthetic composites, allowing for greater customization and durability while maintaining the core ergonomic geometry established by the high-arched tree. The new materials allow for a level of anatomical fitting that Kusinov could only dream of. Modern saddles often feature interchangeable gullets, the front arch, allowing a single saddle to be quickly adjusted to fit the wide, medium, or narrow withers of different horses. This flexibility maintains the critical spinal clearance for a greater variety of mounts, eliminating the need to have a custom-fitted wooden tree for every animal, a massive improvement in both cost and logistics. The padding has also been modernized. The simple felt and blankets of the steppe have been replaced by high-tech materials like orthopedic foam and advanced synthetic fleece. These materials offer superior shock absorption, better breathability, and maintain their shape under pressure, further ensuring that the saddle bars distribute weight evenly without creating localized pressure points. Here's a quirky tidbit about modern testing. In high-end saddle fitting today, pressure mapping technology is routinely used. This involves placing a flexible sensor pad under the saddle to create a real-time color-coded map, showing exactly where the pressure is greatest on the horse's back. This scientific validation confirms the effectiveness of the high-arched design. A properly fitted Kusinov-style tree shows the pressure evenly distributed along the sidebars, and, critically, shows zero pressure in the central spinal channel. Even the most technologically advanced, expensive English jumping saddle, or a simple mass-produced trail saddle, owes its fundamental load-bearing architecture to the principles perfected on the Kazakh steppes. The geometry, refined over decades, is now codified in computer-aided design programs. Historians still argue whether the move to synthetic trees has sacrificed the necessary flexibility of the original rawhide-wrapped wood. While composites offer superior rigidity, some traditionalists maintain that the subtle, natural flex of the wooden tree actually provides a better ergonomic interface with the horse's dynamic movement. The debate is a fascinating modern extension of a 19th century design. Despite all the technological advances, the core lesson remains: the saddle is a bridge. It must hold the load clear of the spine. That is the genius of the design, a practical engineering truth that transcends centuries, cultures, and materials. But who exactly deserves the credit for this monumental idea? You are now in the realm of academic libraries and dusty archives, exploring the heart of the matter, scholarly debate, the true origin story. While we have tracked the design from Muhammad Kusanov to the M1904 saddle, the academic community constantly challenges simple, linear narratives. When discussing a fundamental piece of technology, there are always counterclaims and arguments about precise lineage. The central debate is whether Kusanov was a singular genius or merely the last, most efficient refiner of an existing tradition. Critics of the simple Kazakh horse thief origin point to evidence suggesting similar high-arched, skeletal saddle structures have existed across various nomadic and horse-centered cultures for centuries. One theory suggests the true ancestor is the Mongolian saddle, which for centuries utilized a rigid hippomel and cantle tree for stability during archery and long-distance travel. The Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and Mongolian designs share a cultural DNA rooted in sustained high-intensity riding across the steppes. Proponents of this view argue that Kusanov's saddle was simply a successful local manifestation of a widely known principle, practical perfection rather than a true invention. Another counterargument points to the influence of the Hungarian saddle, often referenced in European military history. The Hungarian model, also known for its lightweight and rigidity, predated the Russian adoption of the steppe saddle and showed similar early attempts at spinal clearance. Historians still argue whether the Russian officers who first championed the steppe saddle were influenced purely by local necessity, or if they were subconsciously seeking a design that had been proven in other heavy cavalry environments, such as Hungary. This ongoing debate is a mainstream historical fact. The precise origin and naming convention, for example, Kyrgyz, Turkestan, Cossack, or Scot of the high-arched rigid tree saddle, are subjects of enduring academic contention. Reflecting the complex multicultural nature of technological transfer in the 19th century, you realize that pinning the credit on one man, even one as colorful as Kusanov, might be an oversimplification. Technology rarely has a single father, it often has many midwives. Kusanov's specific contribution, however, lies in his ruthless efficiency. He took a concept and perfected its ergonomics and material application for the most demanding possible user case: constant high-speed, long-distance evasion. His was the version that, when tested, delivered the undeniable, superior performance that military observers like Captain Scott could not ignore. Here is a quirky tidbit that often gets raised. One fringe theory posits that the design originated not with nomads, but with ancient Chinese military engineers trying to stabilize their riders for fighting. This theory is largely dismissed due to the lack of archaeological evidence showing wide-scale adoption of such high, rigid trees in early Chinese history. But it highlights the lengths researchers go to find a single, definitive origin point. It seems everyone wants credit for the saddle that saved the cavalry. Ultimately, while the principle of spinal clearance may have roots spanning centuries and continents, the specific geometry that influenced the Russian M1891 and the American M1904 can be robustly traced back to the proven field-tested saddles of the Kazakh region, making Muhammad Kusanov the crucial, if anonymous, link in the chain. The final irony, of course, is that the man whose life and freedom depended on the unparalleled efficiency of his design remains almost entirely obscured by history, an inventor with no patent and no memorial. You search the records, the dispatches, and the military histories. Yet the man whose design changed global cavalry logistics remains a shadow, the silent hero of equestrian history. Muhammad Kusanov's name is absent from the official U.S. Army manuals, the Russian Quartermaster Corps' records, and nearly all general histories of the 19th century military. He is the ultimate anonymous inventor. The irony here is profound. A man driven by the immediate, desperate necessity of survival of life lived perpetually on the run created a piece of equipment so functionally perfect that it transcended all geopolitical boundaries and social classes. Yet, because he was an outlaw in a remote part of the world, operating outside the intellectual property systems of the great powers, his name was lost almost immediately in the process of official standardization and military appropriation. When the design was adopted by the Russians, it was generalized as the Kyrgyz or Turkestan pattern, attributing the genius not to an individual, but to an entire region or ethnic group. When Captain Scott brought it to America, it was renamed the Scott Improved, and then, notoriously, the McClellan, completely severing the link to its Central Asian origins. Kusanov was erased by bureaucracy and national pride. This anonymity is a mainstream historical fact. The contributions of indigenous or non-Western individuals to military and civilian technologies were frequently omitted or obscured during the documentation and standardization processes of European and American powers in the 19th and early 20th centuries. You can imagine Kusanov, perhaps late in his life, surviving his outlaw years, and living in some remote yurt. He might have seen a Russian patrol riding past, or perhaps decades later, heard rumors of a war across the sea where soldiers rode on saddles that looked suspiciously familiar. He would never have known that his innovation had reached Washington, D.C., and was being used by armies across the world. His reward was merely a slightly healthier horse and a few extra years of freedom on the steppes. Here, as a quirky tidbit about how names are lost, one theory suggests that the name Muhammad Kusanov was actually first recorded by a low-level Russian civilian official who oversaw saddlery contracts in the Turkestan district. This official, likely mishearing or misspelling the name, may have filed the original report under an ethnic or geographical designation, thus forever burying the true creator's name in the first layer of imperial paperwork. It's a reminder that sometimes history is lost due to a simple administrative mistake. Rather than malice, his legacy lies only in the form itself. Every time you see a rigid tree western saddle with a high gullet, you are looking at the direct lineage of his design. The saddle tree is his true silent monument. Historians still argue whether the deliberate obfuscation of Kusanov's name and Central Asian origins was more of a bureaucratic accident or a calculated military decision to avoid the embarrassment of crediting a nomadic, non-Western, and likely criminal figure with a crucial technological advancement. As we approach the final section, we move from the gritty details of history to a quiet reflection on this remarkable journey. The gift a horse thief gave to the mounted world. You stand at the end of this long, winding journey, looking back at the profound cyclical irony of our story. A thief's gift to the world, the saddle design. Born out of the purest necessity of an outlaw life on the fringes of civilization, ultimately became the global standard for order, logistics, and military efficiency. Muhammad Kusanov, the Kazakh horse thief, didn't set out to revolutionize equestrian equipment. He simply needed to solve an immediate high-stakes problem: how to ride farther, faster, and longer than his pursuers without destroying his only means of survival, his horse. His innovation was not driven by profit or prestige, but by the ultimate evolutionary. This led to a design that was stripped of all unnecessary complexity and focused entirely on functional biomechanics. His simple, brilliant insight to skeletal, high-arched saddle tree that lifted the weight entirely off the horse's spine and distributed it across the strongest muscles is his true, lasting monument. This practical, field-proven engineering was the solution to a problem that had plagued cavalry forces and professional riders for centuries: the debilitating injury and subsequent downtime caused by poorly designed equipment. This transition from an outlaw's personal necessity to a universal tool is a mainstream historical fact and a classic example of how technological diffusion occurs. A superior design, regardless of its unsavory origins, is eventually adopted by large conservative institutions because its performance advantage is simply too great to ignore. The needs of the Tsarist frontier, Captain Scott's pragmatic observational skills, and the logistical demands of 2 world wars all conspired to validate and standardize the thief's gift. You now see the design in its final reflected form. It's in the saddle of a modern-day rancher roping cattle in Montana, in the equipment of a park ranger patrolling the Rockies, and in the precision-engineered synthetic trees used by competitive endurance riders. The technology has changed, the users have changed, but the core geometry, the elevated bridge holding the load clear of the withers and spine remains. Kusanov's original concept. Here's a quirky tidbit to close the historical loop. Some modern custom saddle makers, who still use rawhide-wrapped wooden trees, often purchase their raw materials from Central Asian suppliers, unknowingly importing the materials and methods that are direct descendants of Kusanov's own manufacturing techniques from over a century ago. The steppe still supplies the backbone of the world's best saddles. Historians still argue whether the greatest legacy of the saddle is the massive reduction in equine suffering it caused a veterinary revolution, or its critical role in maintaining the mobility of armies during a crucial period of global conflict. A military revolution. In the end, it was both a perfect piece of engineering that benefited the soldier, the rancher, and, most importantly, the horse. It's a wonderful lesson. Sometimes the best and most enduring solutions don't come from prestigious laboratories or heavily funded military contractors, but from the necessity of those living the toughest lives, often those on the run, who have to be ruthlessly efficient simply to survive. The long day is fading now, and the journey through the steppes, the war rooms, and the dusty plains is complete. I invite you to settle back deeper into your chair, feeling the weight of this story settle gently around you. You've traveled through time and across continents, following a humble piece of wood and hide that quietly changed the world. Think of that silent man, Mukham Kusanov, riding under the harsh Central Asian sun, his freedom clinging to the genius of his hands. His focus was only on the next horizon, the next mile, the simple, quiet need of his loyal horse. That singular, pure focus created a legacy far grander than any empire or dynasty. Let the noise of the narrative soften now. The images of cavalry and cold steel are fading. You are left only with the rhythm of the ride, the feeling of sustained motion across a vast, endless landscape. Remember that often the most important inventions aren't the loudest or the most complicated, but the ones that solve the most fundamental problems with the simplest elegance. You are safe here now, grounded in the present. Let the details drift away like dust on the breeze. Take a deep, slow breath, feel the support beneath you, and know that you are precisely where you need to be. Sleep well and dream lightly.